Jack Davis, Al Williamson, Jack Kamen, Bernard Crigston, Reed Crandall, George Evans, and Graham Ghastly Ingalls. Soon, these creators were as popular as the Crypt Keeper himself. However, a new superstar would soon be added, arguably one of the greatest comic book creators of all time, Harvey Kurtzman. Kurtzman was born on October 3, 1924 in Brooklyn, New York, to David and Edith Kurtzman. A Russian Jewish urbanite family, they had suffered from anti-Semitism from generations which shaped their worldview. His father, David, had joined the Christian Science Church, and as a result of its teachings, when he suffered a bleeding ulcer, instead of seeking medical treatment, he turned to prayer. Sadly, David Kurtzman died on November 29, 1928 at the age of 36, leaving his family in such dire financial straits that Harvey Kurtzman's mother, Edith, placed him and his brothers in an orphanage for 3 months. Several months later, she remarried to Abraham Peekers, a printing engraver and trade unionist, whose progressive ideology, as Kurtzman would say, he was raised a red diaper baby, subscribed them to the Daily Worker and sent young Harvey to Camp Kinderland, a left-wing camp whose dogmatic atmosphere Harvey did not enjoy. Abraham did encourage Harvey's burgeoning art talent and told him to think of himself as a professional artist. While a shy boy, Harvey Kurtzman so impressed his teachers they encouraged him to skip a grade, and his sidewalk chalk drawings brought the admiration of his fellow classmates. His parents continued to support his artistic endeavors, with his stepfather taking Harvey and his brothers to museums whenever they could. However, by the late 1930s, his taste swerved to comic book strips in his neighbors' papers, such as Dick Tracy and Prince Valiant, and when he discovered The Spirit by Will Eisner, he was hooked, calling it the standard for all other comic book strips. At 14, he won a cartooning contest, which awarded him $1 along with his work being published in Tip Top Comics number 36 in April of 1939. Kurtzman later studied at Manhattan's High School of Music and Art, where he would meet many of his lifelong friends and colleagues, notably Al Jaffe and Will Elder, his frequent collaborator, along with Harry Chester and John Severin. He graduated at 16 and went on to Cooper Union on a scholarship, but left a year later to focus on being a professional cartoonist. Kurtzman did a number of odd jobs throughout the early 1940s and won his big break in 1942, when he went to work for Louis Furstad's studio, which produced comics Quality, Ace, Gilberton, and the Daily Worker. His first published work with the company was Classic Comics number 5 on September of 1942, and his first penciled work was The Four Favorites number 8 on December of 1942. He continued more work before being drafted into World War II, where he was trained in the infantry, but once the Army discovered his skills as an artist, employed him to design posters and instruction manuals, similar to what happened to Will Eisner and Stan Lee. While serving, Kurtzman was invited by publisher and cartoonist L.B. Cole to draw Black Venus for Ray Herman's Orbit Publishing. He continued other comic book work throughout 1944 and 1945, including the satirical Yank comic strip, honing his craft while still serving his country. After being discharged, Kurtzman found the new freelancing world of cartooning hard, even being rejected by legendary cartoonist Walt Kelly. He decided to try and go with his own studio with his old classmates Will Elder and George Stern, forming the Charles William Harvey Studio in 1947, but the three had little business sense and were forced to lease their studio space to other cartoonists before finally closing in 1951. In 1949, Kurtzman came to EC, still believing it stood for Educational Comics, with an idea for the kind of stories they wanted. Gaines and Feldstein were immediately blown away by his one-page panel Hey Look humor strips, but since they were now publishing mostly horror and sci-fi, EC didn't have a place for his humor work. Hey Look was previously published by Timely under Stan Lee, where Kurtzman met his future wife, Adele Hassan. Nevertheless, Gaines thought Kurtzman was too talented to waste, so he set him up with his uncle, David Gaines, who actually was producing Educational Comics. His first story was, of all things, Luck Fights It Through, a Western story about syphilis, complete with a song, That Ignorant, Ignorant Cowboy. By 1950, Kurtzman ended up creating two of EC's war titles, Two Fitz's Tales and Frontline Combat, but like Gaines and Feldstein, he carried a social concept to his work. In his Korean War tales, sometimes it took the perspective of the North Korean troops, a rarity at the time, and he refused to portray them as racist caricatures. By 1951, EC was financially solvent, with Feldstein editing 7 books while Kurtzman did his 2 war books, sometimes editing a bit too carefully, doing painful research on military equipment and vehicles. As a result, he moved much slower than Feldstein, and thus making a fraction of the money. Kurtzman went to Gaines about this, which caused a dilemma. Feldstein was producing more books, thus deserving more money, and Kurtzman didn't want to work on any of the horror titles, which he found offensive. Finally, Gaines remembered Kurtzman's past as a humor cartoonist and suggested he make a new humor comic. Kurtzman was intrigued and began studying college humor magazines for inspiration. Soon he had an idea for a humor book unlike any other before it. He would call it Mad. The first issue was in fact titled Tales Calculated to Drive You Mad when it debuted in the late summer of 1952, before eventually shortening the title to just Mad, as its heading kept getting smaller and smaller. Kurtzman edited the first 28 issues, along with writing most of the scripts and even doing sketches for the artwork. Ever the taskmaster, he insisted the artists, which included Will Elder, Jack Davis, Wally Wood, and John Severin, to stick to every visual gag and nuance in his sketches, providing a definitive vision of what this new comic would be. In the first issue, all 4 stories lampooned a different EC comic, such as Genis, which was a Yiddish for thieves, mocking shock suspense stories. Kurtzman's writing was sharper and more adult than any other humor book, billed as the humor in the jugular vein, its early subtitle for Mad, often spoofing other comic books. It was not an instant success at first, but by issue number 4, the comic book was selling out. That issue featured Super Duper Man, drawn by Wally Wood, which lampooned Superman and Captain Marvel, including the copyright infringement lawsuit brought by National against Fox at the time. As a result, National now threatened to sue EC, which ironically both companies had the same lawyers. However, Kurtzman found a legal precedent protecting parody, and Gaines sought out a new lawyer who said they were in the right. Ultimately, National never sued. In Mad number 12, it spoofed Archie with Starchy, depicting them as real teenagers who smoke and live with white trash family that routinely beat them. Something that the current CW TV series Riverdale is quite close to now. Soon, Mad was going after movies and TV with Ping Pong lampooning King Kong and Howdy Dolt mocking Howdy Doody. Kurtzman even went into politics, mocking the Army McCarthy hearings in the Mad number 17 with What's My Shine, illustrated by Jack Davis, where the idea of Senator McCarthy's trying to find communists in the Army turned into a game show. It was this kind of attention that brought EC to the attention of the government, along with their horror and crime titles, with the FBI being open on a FBI file being opened on them. When Gaines learned this, he reportedly celebrated, believing he finally made it. The influence of Mad cannot be underestimated, as it remains the premier comic book magazine of even today, and has influenced everyone from stand-up comedians like Lenny Bruce, comic book artists Art Spiegelman and Robert Crumb, and filmmaker Terry Gilliam, along with The Simpsons creator Matt Groening. By April of 1954, Mad went monthly over a bi-monthly to replace Frontline Combat, which had been canceled due to low sales after the end of the Korean War. The company would use all kinds of writers, notably Ray Bradbury, who would later cameo Mad Magazine in an adaptation of his book Fahrenheit 451 as one of the books burned. This came about not so innocently, though, when Gaines and Feldstein plagiarized 2 of Bradbury's stories and combined them into one. When Bradbury learned of this, instead of threatening to sue, he wrote the company praising the adaptation. He did also note he hadn't received his royalty payment yet, though. EC immediately sent a check and then negotiated a deal for more Bradbury adaptations, which includes his stories as A Sound of Thunder and Weird Science Fantasy number 2 on June of 1952, and The October Game and Shock Suspense Stories number 9 on March of 1948. This was considered a high point of EC. Frank Frazetta even did covers, such as for Weird Science Fantasy number 21 in September-October of 1953, and in number 29, which covered all kinds of genres, many of which were the first successful ones of their kind, from horror to science fiction to war and adventure, all of which were anthology stories. Naturally, the success of EC comic books in the crime line brought about imitators, which brought about critics in and outside the government as well. Most notable was Dr. Frederick Werven, whose years-long campaign against comic books culminated in his book The Seduction of the Innocent in 1954, claiming comic books were the chief cause of juvenile delinquency. Werven attracted supporters, such as the Attorney General of Massachusetts, who called for the banning of Panic, a short-lived sister book of Mad EC had produced. In its premiere issue, Panic ran a story spoofing C.C. Moore's poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, which critics claimed desecrated Christmas. Police in New York actually seized issues of Panic from the newsstands and banned its sales until Gaines sued in court and won. Gaines loved this kind of attention, and soon Mad had even more imitators, such as Nuts, Whack, Unsane, Bughouse, Crazy, and Panic was actually a response to these written knockoffs, as Gaines thought if Mad was going to have a ripoff, it should be by EC itself. Thus, he approached Harvey Kurtzman to write and edit it, with Al Feinstein doing the cover, illustrating Santa Claus stepping into a bear trap. However, the fury of EC was just beginning. Gaines did try to head off this controversy back in 1948. when he formed the Association of Comic Books Magazine Publishers to set up an industrial code of self-censorship. However, many publishers like Dell refused to join, and EC eventually left itself when Gaines got into a dispute with the executive director, Henry Schultz. Granted, it was rarely enforced, as many comic books carried the ACMP seal without any formal review. On April 21, 1964, Gaines testified for the Senate subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency. He and his business partner, Lyle Stewart, were up all night crafting their testimony, asserting that it had been bad parenting, not comic books, that caused juvenile delinquency. It was a well-crafted speech, but it fell on deaf ears at the committee. At one point, Dr. Wervin even accused EC Comic Books of promoting racism, ignoring numerous stories like Judgment Day that preached the exact opposite. Gaines did well in his testimony at first, but as the hearing dragged on, his medication, Dexedrine, he was taking for weight loss, started to wear off. Speaking with Senator Etz Knefer from Tennessee, Gaines said he was proud of his comics. One story that was used against him, though, was in Shock Suspense Stories number 14 about a little girl who frames her mother for murder. Of course, the most infamous evidence was the cover of Crime Suspense Stories number 22 on May of 1954 by Johnny Craig, which featured a man carrying a bloody axe and holding a severed head. When asked if this was in good taste, Gaines said yes, it was for a horror comic. The comic made headlines, and it led to a public backlash across the country. By the summer, the outrage had caused a nationwide slump in comic book sales. EC could have weathered the storm, but the insidious questioning by Senator Knefer over EC's distribution method, pointing out that unopened bundles could be returned for full refunds, gave newsstands the tools to hurt the company as well. As a result, many magazine stands used this to send EC's books back without even opening them, which ultimately led the company to folding due to the loss of money. Kefauver had presidential ambitions as well, having previously investigated the mob and Frank Costello, who had ties to National Comics and Harry Donenfeld, and EC was just another notch in his cap. Bill Gaines called an emergency meeting of his fellow comic book publishers, personally paying for a town hall that eventually saw most of the comic book publishers show up, with publisher John Goldwater of Archie Comics being named chairman. Gaines thought he was successful in finally uniting the comic book publishers. His hope was to hire a public relations firm to repair comic books' image while fighting back against censorship, which Gaines viewed as a freedom of the press issue. Instead of fighting back, Gaines was shocked to see his fellow comic book publishers voting for self-censorship, forming a new industrial group, the Comic Books Magazine Association of America, with its new code, the Comic Books Code Authority. However, Gaines shouldn't have been entirely shocked, as he spent the last few years using EC to mock the other comic book publishers. 90% of the industry supported it, assembling on September 16, 1954, and appointed Judge Charles E. Murphy with a $100,000 budget. By October of 26, 1954, Murphy had a code hammered out and was officially adopted. Notoriously, the publishers agreed to ban the words crime, horror, terror, and weird from the titles of their books, a clear attack on EC. Gaines had no choice, and by September 14, 1964, EC released a statement that they would be dropping horror and crime comics for a new line to be released in 1965, but he refused to join the association in protest. That wouldn't stop the CCA from still coming after EC. Bill Gaines had EC invest $250,000 into a new clean line with titles like Impact, Valor, and Aces High, along with renaming Weird Fantasy into Incredible Science Fiction, while dropping his horror and crime comics. However, he was still refused to join the association. As a result, none of the newsstands would carry his clean comics without the CCA endorsement. Finally, Gaines tried to join the CCA, but John Goldwater, the owner of Archie Comics and chairman of the CCA, wouldn't let EC join without an apology for his previous statements about the association. The board did take up Gaines's appeal, but Goldwater reportedly told him, "If you want to join my association, you're going to have to apologize to me personally." Eventually, other publishers became outraged by Goldwater's treatment of Gaines and threatened to resign over it. Goldwater was finally outvoted, and EC was allowed to join the CCA, with the sales picking up only slightly, though, as the company was still blackballed by distributors. A clear testament of the hypocrisy of the code came when the classic story Judgment Day was reprinted in Incredible Science Fiction number 33 in February of 1956, originally to replace a story that was code disapproved. However, Judge Murphy, who oversaw the CCA, insisted Tarleton, the lead character of the story, couldn't be black. Feldstein argued that was the point of the story, but Murphy insisted his race had to be changed. When Gaines interjected, Murphy conceded he could remain black, but the beads of sweat on his face had to be removed. Flabbergasted, Gaines and Feldstein ran the story as is, but it became obvious the CCA was being used as a tool to run the EC out of business. An incredible science